From offshore, it looked like the bombardment had worked. There was no movement, no return fire, just a silent black island in the Pacific. For days, battleships and aircraft had pounded the surface, targeting everything that could be seen. The plan was simple: destroy the defenses, land on the beaches, and move inland. But when the first wave approached the shore, nothing happened. No machine gun fire, no artillery, no resistance. It felt wrong, because this wasn't what they had seen before. The Marines stepped onto the volcanic sand, expecting the fight to begin at the waterline. But the enemy wasn't there. They were waiting, hidden beneath the surface, inside a defensive system that had survived everything thrown at it. And once the landing force was fully exposed, the battle would begin, on ground that offered no cover and no way back. The assumption of control. The approach to Iwo Jima was built on expectations shaped by previous operations across the Pacific. Amphibious doctrine emphasized overwhelming preparatory fire, designed to neutralize defensive positions before the first landing craft reached the shore. Naval bombardment was intended to break the enemy's ability to coordinate, destroy artillery, and reduce resistance to isolated pockets. In the days leading up to the assault, U.S. naval forces conducted sustained shelling of the island. Battleships and cruisers targeted known positions, focusing on visible structures, suspected gun emplacements, and elevated terrain features. Carrier-based aircraft extended this effort, striking surface targets across the island. From an operational perspective, the volume of fire was considered sufficient to degrade the defensive system to a manageable level. Reconnaissance, however, provided only a partial understanding of the battlefield. The island's surface appeared exposed, dominated by Mount Suribachi in the south and a series of ridges extending inland. While these features were identified as potential strongpoints, their internal structure remained largely unknown. Intelligence estimates assumed that most defensive positions were located near the shoreline or in easily identifiable locations. Command planning reflected this assessment. Landing zones were selected based on accessibility, with the expectation that initial resistance would be limited. Units were assigned objectives beyond the beaches, anticipating rapid movement inland once a foothold had been secured. Timelines were structured around the assumption that the most intense phase of combat would occur during the approach, not after landing. As the assault force moved into position, the operational picture appeared stable. Amphibious vehicles were organized into successive waves, each carrying infantry, equipment, and communication elements required to establish control. Naval gunfire continued into the final stages before landing, maintaining pressure on surface targets. From offshore, there were no clear indications of organized resistance. The absence of visible enemy activity reinforced existing assumptions. It suggested that the bombardment had achieved its objective, that defensive positions had been neutralized, and that the landing would proceed under favorable conditions. Units prepared to disembark with the expectation of encountering only fragmented opposition. What remained unobserved was the structure of the defense beneath the surface. The island's volcanic composition allowed for the construction of concealed positions resistant to surface bombardment. Rather than concentrating forces along the shoreline, defensive elements had been positioned within an interconnected system of underground fortifications designed to survive the initial phase of the assault. This approach fundamentally altered the expected sequence of engagement. Instead of contesting the landing directly, defensive forces preserved their strength for a controlled response once the assault units were committed and exposed. The terrain that appeared vulnerable from a distance concealed positions capable of delivering coordinated fire from multiple directions. As the first wave advanced toward the beaches, the lack of resistance was interpreted as confirmation of success. Formations remained intact, and movement followed established plans. Equipment was prepared for rapid deployment, and communication channels remained functional. From the perspective of the landing force, conditions suggested control of the immediate environment. The underlying reality had not changed. The defensive system remained operational, positioned to engage at a moment when maneuver options would be limited. The transition from approach to combat would not occur at the shoreline but beyond it. where exposure would replace momentum. The initial phase of the operation had been shaped by assumptions that would soon be tested against a defensive structure designed to exploit those very expectations. The silent landing. The initial movement toward the beaches of Iwo Jima unfolded without the resistance that had been anticipated. Landing craft advanced in formation, maintaining intervals and alignment as they crossed the final stretch of water. Naval gunfire had ceased according to schedule, and the transition from bombardment to landing was executed without interruption. From the perspective of the assault units, the absence of immediate enemy fire suggested that preparatory strikes had achieved their intended effect. Amphibious tractors reached the shoreline first, followed by successive waves of landing craft. Infantry units began disembarking in organized sequence, moving from vehicles into the shallow surf and onto the volcanic sand. Equipment was unloaded according to plan, including communication gear, ammunition, and support weapons. Initial movements inland were limited as units focused on establishing a stable landing zone and maintaining cohesion. The terrain presented immediate challenges. The beach consisted of loose volcanic ash, which reduced traction and slowed movement. Vehicles struggled to maintain momentum, and troops carrying full equipment loads found it difficult to advance quickly. Despite these conditions, formations remained largely intact, and command elements continued to direct movement according to pre-established objectives. What defined this phase was the continued absence of direct opposition. There was no concentrated fire from the shoreline, no visible movement from defensive positions, and no immediate counteraction against the landing force. This reinforced the belief that the defensive system had been significantly degraded. Units continued to disembark and organize, extending their presence across the beach while preparing for the next phase of the advance. The structure of the landing operation depended on the rapid buildup of combat power at the shoreline. Successive waves brought additional infantry, engineering units, and heavy equipment. Communication lines were established between units on the beach and command elements offshore. Naval support remained available, but its role shifted from preparatory bombardment to responsive fire support as needed. However, the concentration of forces at the landing zone created a growing vulnerability. As more units arrived, the density of personnel and equipment increased, while mobility remained limited by terrain conditions. The loose surface and restricted space slowed the distribution of forces inland, resulting in a buildup along the beach. This accumulation occurred without interference, further reinforcing the perception that resistance would be minimal. Unobserved by the landing forces, defensive positions remained intact beneath the surface. The absence of fire was not a result of destruction, but of timing. Defensive elements maintained concealment, allowing assault units to commit fully to the landing before initiating engagement. This delay preserved their capacity to deliver coordinated fire against a concentrated and exposed target. As the first hour of the landing progressed, the operational picture appeared stable. Units continued to arrive, positions were being established, and command structures remained functional. There was no immediate indication that the situation differed from initial expectations. The landing had been executed and control of the shoreline seemed within reach. The conditions that had allowed for an uncontested landing were temporary. The concentration of forces, combined with restricted movement and limited cover, created an environment in which the landing units were increasingly vulnerable. The absence of resistance had enabled the buildup of combat power, but it had also positioned those forces in a manner that reduced their ability to respond quickly to a sudden change in conditions. That change had not yet occurred. The silence that defined the landing phase remained in place, reinforcing assumptions of success and control. Units continued to operate within the framework of the original plan, unaware that the defensive system they had expected to encounter had been deliberately withheld. The transition from landing to engagement was imminent. The conditions that had allowed for organized deployment would soon give way to a phase defined by exposure, limited maneuverability, and the activation of a defensive network designed to exploit both. The hidden fire. The shift from controlled landing to active engagement occurred without warning. The conditions that had defined the initial phase, silence, organization, and forward movement, were abruptly replaced by coordinated fire originating from positions that had not been identified during reconnaissance or bombardment. The first indications came as indirect fire began to impact the landing zones. Mortars and artillery concealed within the island's interior opened with precision. Impacts were concentrated along the beach and the immediate approaches inland, targeting areas where personnel and equipment had accumulated. The density of forces, previously a requirement for establishing a foothold, now increased vulnerability. Units that had been moving in formation were forced to disperse under fire, disrupting coordination. Direct fire followed. Machine guns and small arms engaged from multiple angles, originating from concealed openings within the terrain. Rather than a linear defensive line along the shoreline, fire was delivered from elevated positions and recessed emplacements integrated into the volcanic ridges. These positions had been constructed to limit exposure while maintaining fields of fire that intersected across the landing zones. The effect was immediate. Movement inland slowed further as units sought cover in an environment that offered little natural protection. The volcanic sand, which had already reduced mobility, now provided no resistance against incoming fire. Shallow depressions and scattered debris became temporary shelter, but they did not offer sustained protection. Units attempting to advance were exposed during movement, while those remaining in place became fixed targets. Command and control began to degrade under these conditions. Communication equipment dependent on stable positioning and line of sight was affected by both terrain and fire. Signals between units became intermittent, and coordination across adjacent elements was reduced. Decisions that had been planned at the operational level were now being made at smaller unit levels, often without complete information. Attempts to locate and suppress the source of fire were complicated by the structure of the defensive system. Positions were not only concealed but interconnected. Firing points could be abandoned and reoccupied through underground passages, allowing defenders to shift positions without exposing themselves. This made it difficult to identify a fixed target for naval or artillery response. Naval gunfire support was called in to engage suspected positions, but the effectiveness was limited. Without precise coordinates, fire missions were based on observation and estimation. The terrain absorbed much of the impact, and the defensive network beneath the surface remained largely intact. Air support faced similar challenges as targets were not clearly visible and engagement risked proximity to friendly forces. Engineering units began to move forward with the objective of creating access routes and clearing obstacles. Their role, originally intended to support rapid movement inland, shifted toward enabling survival under fire. Clearing paths through the loose terrain allowed for limited redistribution of forces, but progress remained slow. The nature of the engagement revealed the intent behind the defensive design. By withholding fire during the landing, defensive forces had allowed the concentration of assault units within a restricted area. Once committed, those forces were engaged under conditions that limited maneuver and increased exposure. The initial advantage of momentum had been replaced by a static environment where movement carried immediate risk. As the engagement continued, units adjusted to the new conditions. Movement became incremental, based on short advances between limited cover points. Suppression fire was used to create temporary windows for repositioning, but the absence of clearly defined targets reduced its effectiveness. The battlefield no longer resembled the expected progression from beachhead to inland advance. It had become a zone of contested control where each movement required coordination under pressure. The transition from landing to sustained combat had occurred within a narrow time frame. The assumptions that had guided the approach were no longer applicable. The defensive system, previously unseen, had defined the terms of engagement, and the assault force was now operating within constraints that had not been anticipated during planning. The ground that would not move. Advancing beyond the landing zone required a transition from organized movement to incremental control of terrain that resisted both speed and coordination. The surface conditions alone imposed limitations. The volcanic ash that covered much of the island reduced traction for both personnel and vehicles, making rapid movement impossible. Every step inland required effort, and every attempt to accelerate resulted in loss of stability and exposure. Units that had established positions near the shoreline began to push forward in small elements, attempting to extend the line of control. Movement was conducted in short bursts, often limited to a few meters at a time. Suppression fire was used to create temporary gaps in enemy engagement, but the absence of clearly defined defensive lines made it difficult to determine where that fire should be concentrated. The result was a pattern of advance that lacked momentum, with units progressing unevenly across the terrain. The defensive system continued to operate with a level of coordination that had not been degraded by the initial bombardment. Positions embedded within the ridges and beneath the surface remained active, delivering fire from angles that were difficult to anticipate. Machine gun nests positioned to cover overlapping sectors engaged any movement across open ground. Mortar fire adjusted to target areas where units attempted to regroup or establish temporary cover. The terrain amplified the effectiveness of these defensive positions. Elevated features provided observation and range, while the volcanic composition allowed for the construction of protected firing points that were resistant to indirect fire. Units attempting to advance were forced to move within these fields of observation, often without the ability to identify the source of engagement. Engineering efforts shifted toward creating usable routes through the terrain. Equipment was brought forward to stabilize sections of the beach and establish pathways that could support the movement of heavier assets. These efforts were conducted under continuous fire, limiting both speed and scale. The objective was no longer rapid advance, but the gradual expansion of areas where movement could occur with reduced risk. Communication between units remained inconsistent. Terrain features disrupted line-of-sight transmission, and the dispersion of forces made coordination more difficult. Command elements adapted by delegating authority to smaller unit leaders, allowing decisions to be made based on immediate conditions rather than centralized directives. This approach enabled localized progress, but reduced the ability to execute coordinated maneuvers across a broader front. Attempts to suppress defensive positions relied increasingly on close-range engagement. Units identified suspected firing points through observation of muzzle flashes or movement, then directed concentrated fire toward those locations. In some cases, this resulted in temporary reduction of enemy activity, but the interconnected nature of the defensive system allowed positions to be reoccupied or reinforced from below ground. The accumulation of equipment and personnel near the landing zones continued to present logistical challenges. Supplies had to be moved forward across terrain that slowed transport and increased exposure. Ammunition distribution, medical evacuation, and reinforcement of forward positions all depended on routes that were not fully secured. Each of these functions competed for limited space and time under conditions that did not allow for sustained organization. The pattern of engagement established during this phase defined the nature of the operation moving forward. There would be no rapid breakthrough, no clear transition from landing to inland maneuver. Instead, progress depended on the ability to isolate and neutralize individual positions within a defensive network that had been designed to resist conventional assault. As units continued to move inland, the distance gained did not reflect the effort required to achieve it. Control of terrain was measured not in large advances, but in the gradual reduction of active defensive points. Each position cleared created a small area of relative security, but also revealed additional layers of resistance beyond it. The ground itself dictated the pace of the operation. Movement was constrained, visibility was limited, and the defensive system remained capable of adapting to each attempt at advance. The initial objective of establishing control had evolved into a sustained effort to impose movement on a battlefield that resisted it at every level. The Southern Anchor. Control of the southern sector was defined by the presence of Mount Suribachi, a dominant terrain feature that influenced both observation and engagement across the landing zones. Its elevation provided a clear view of the beaches and the immediate approaches inland, allowing defensive forces to direct fire with accuracy against any concentration of movement below. From the outset of the landing, fire originating from this position contributed to the disruption of organized advance. Artillery and machine gun fire, delivered from concealed emplacements within the slopes, targeted landing areas and routes of movement. The structure of the defenses made direct observation difficult. Openings were minimal, and firing points were integrated into the terrain, reducing exposure while maintaining effective coverage. Securing this position became a priority not only for its symbolic significance, but for its operational impact. As long as Suribachi remained under defensive control, the southern landing zones would continue to be observed and engaged. Units assigned to this objective were required to advance across ground that offered limited cover, under conditions where the direction of incoming fire could not always be determined. Movement toward the base of the mountain was conducted in small elements, using available depressions in the terrain to reduce exposure. Suppression fire was directed toward suspected positions, but the effectiveness was limited by the concealed nature of the defenses. Progress was measured in short advances, often requiring repeated attempts to secure small sections of ground. Engineering units supported this effort by identifying and clearing obstacles that restricted movement. Their role included the neutralization of surface obstacles and the preparation of routes that allowed infantry to approach the slopes. These tasks were carried out under fire, requiring coordination between engineering teams and covering elements. As units reached the lower elevations, the nature of the engagement shifted. The terrain became more restrictive, with steeper gradients and reduced maneuver space. Defensive positions were positioned to exploit these conditions, engaging from higher ground while remaining protected within the structure of the mountain. The interconnected nature of the defensive system allowed for repositioning without exposure, complicating attempts to isolate individual firing points. Close-range engagement became necessary to reduce these positions. Units advanced using short, controlled movements, coordinating suppression with forward elements tasked with identifying and neutralizing specific targets. This approach required continuous communication at the small unit level, as broader coordination remained limited by terrain and ongoing fire. Naval and air support were available, but their application was constrained by proximity to friendly forces and the difficulty of identifying precise targets. Fire missions were adjusted to support advancing units, but the terrain absorbed much of the impact, and the defensive network within the mountain remained largely intact during the initial stages of the assault. Logistical support for this operation required the movement of supplies from the landing zones to forward positions at the base of the mountain. This included ammunition, medical materials, and communication equipment. The routes used for this purpose were exposed and subject to observation, requiring protection and coordination to maintain continuity of supply. The effort to secure Suribachi was not defined by rapid movement, but by the gradual reduction of defensive capability within a confined area. Each position engaged required focused action, and each advance created new exposure to additional points of resistance. The process was cumulative, with progress dependent on the ability to sustain pressure under conditions that limited both speed and visibility. As control of the lower slopes began to shift, the influence of Suribachi over the landing zones started to diminish. However, the defensive system within the mountain continued to function, maintaining the capacity to engage and delay further movement. The southern sector remained contested, with the outcome dependent on the continued application of coordinated effort at close range. The position had anchored the defensive structure of the island. Its reduction would alter the balance of observation and fire across the battlefield, but achieving that result required operating within a terrain that had been specifically prepared to resist direct assault. The subterranean defense. As control of surface terrain began to shift in localized areas, the primary challenge transitioned from visible engagement to the systematic reduction of a defensive network operating beneath the surface. The structure of this network defined the operational limits of the assault. Positions that had been suppressed or bypassed during surface advances continued to function through concealed connections, allowing defensive elements to reappear in areas that had already been contested. The construction of the underground system enabled a level of mobility that did not depend on exposed movement. Tunnels connected firing points, observation posts, and supply areas, allowing personnel to relocate without entering direct line of fire. This reduced the effectiveness of suppression tactics, as the absence of activity at one position did not indicate neutralization. Engagement could resume from the same location or from an adjacent point within a short interval. Units advancing inland encountered resistance that did not conform to a fixed defensive line. Instead, engagement occurred in isolated bursts, often originating from positions that had not been previously identified. This created a pattern of movement in which areas thought to be secured required repeated clearing. The concept of a continuous front became less applicable, replaced by a series of contested zones interconnected by unseen routes. Close-range engagement became the primary method for reducing these positions. Identification of entry points to the underground system was based on observation of fire, terrain irregularities, and captured information. Once located, these points required direct action to neutralize. This process involved coordinated movement between elements providing suppression and those tasked with approaching and securing the opening. The confined nature of these entry points limited the number of personnel that could engage simultaneously. This reduced the advantage of larger unit strength and placed emphasis on small unit coordination. Communication within these elements was immediate and direct, with decisions made based on rapidly changing conditions. The objective was to prevent reoccupation and ensure that the position could no longer support further engagement. Engineering support played a critical role in this phase. Equipment and materials were used to seal or render inoperable sections of the underground network. This work was conducted under conditions where the exact extent of the system was not fully known, requiring repeated verification that positions had been effectively neutralized. The process was methodical, with each identified segment addressed individually. The persistence of the defensive network affected logistical operations as well. Routes used for supply and evacuation could be engaged from concealed positions that had not been detected during initial clearing. This required continuous monitoring and, in some cases, the reallocation of forces to secure areas that had previously been considered stable. The movement of ammunition, medical support, and reinforcements depended on maintaining control over these routes. Naval and air support were less effective against this type of defense. The absence of visible targets limited the ability to apply firepower with precision. As a result, reliance shifted further toward ground-based efforts, with progress dependent on the ability of units to identify and neutralize positions through direct engagement. The defensive strategy had achieved its intended effect. By avoiding exposure during the initial phases and preserving combat capability within a protected network, defensive forces extended the duration and complexity of the engagement. The assault force, while increasing its control of surface terrain, remained constrained by a system that allowed resistance to continue without requiring large-scale movement. Advancement through this environment required a sustained application of effort across multiple points simultaneously. Each position reduced contributed to overall progress, but did not eliminate the possibility of engagement from adjacent areas. The structure of the battlefield had shifted from open movement to controlled reduction, where the objective was not rapid advance but the gradual removal of the defensive system's capacity to operate. As units continued to move inland, the interaction between surface control and subterranean resistance defined the pace of the operation. The terrain that had initially limited movement now concealed the final layer of organized defense, requiring a continued focus on precision, coordination, and persistence to achieve full control. The cost of control. The final phase of the operation was defined not by a decisive breakthrough, but by the gradual exhaustion of the defensive system and the continued application of pressure across a fragmented battlefield. Surface control had expanded, but the capacity for resistance remained present in isolated positions, sustained by the remnants of the underground network and the terrain that had supported it from the beginning. Units advancing inland operated within a structure that no longer resembled a continuous front. Engagement occurred in localized areas, often without direct coordination between adjacent elements. Each unit was responsible for identifying, isolating, and neutralizing remaining points of resistance within its assigned sector. Progress was measured by the reduction of these positions rather than by distance gained. The terrain continued to impose limitations. Volcanic ridges, uneven ground, and restricted lines of sight affected both movement and communication. Even in areas where organized resistance had been reduced, the possibility of engagement remained. This required a sustained level of caution, with units maintaining readiness despite the apparent absence of immediate threats. Logistical operations adapted to support this pattern of engagement. Supply routes, initially established to sustain a rapid advance, were reoriented to support dispersed units operating across multiple points. Ammunition, medical materials, and equipment were distributed based on localized needs rather than centralized planning. The continuity of these routes remained essential, as interruptions could affect the ability of forward elements to maintain pressure. Medical evacuation and casualty management became a continuous process. The nature of the engagement, characterized by close-range encounters and repeated clearing of fortified positions, resulted in sustained losses over time. Evacuation routes were coordinated to move personnel from forward areas to collection points, where further transport could be arranged. This process required coordination under conditions that did not allow for extended pauses in combat activity. Command structures adjusted to reflect the decentralized nature of the battlefield. Decision-making authority was distributed across multiple levels, allowing units to respond to immediate conditions without reliance on broader coordination. This approach supported continued progress, but also reflected the limitations imposed by terrain and communication. Naval and air support remained available, but their role was reduced in comparison to earlier phases. With fewer identifiable targets and increased proximity between friendly forces and remaining defensive positions, the application of large-scale firepower became less practical. The emphasis remained on ground operations, where direct engagement continued to define outcomes. The defensive system, while degraded, had fulfilled its objective of extending the duration and complexity of the assault. By preserving combat capability through concealment and controlled engagement, it had required the attacking force to commit resources and time beyond initial expectations. The structure of the defense ensured that each stage of the operation imposed additional requirements for coordination, supply, and sustained effort. As remaining positions were reduced, control of the island became a matter of confirming the absence of organized resistance rather than overcoming a unified defensive line. Units conducted systematic sweeps of assigned areas, verifying that positions could no longer support further engagement. This process required attention to detail and continued discipline, as isolated resistance could persist beyond the collapse of coordinated defense. The outcome of the operation reflected the interaction between planning assumptions and battlefield reality. Initial expectations of a rapid landing followed by organized advance had been replaced by a prolonged engagement defined by terrain, concealment, and the structure of the defense. The cost of achieving control was measured not only in time and resources, but in the sustained effort required to adapt to conditions that had not been fully anticipated. Control in this context did not result from a single decisive action. It was the cumulative result of incremental advances, repeated engagements, and the systematic reduction of a defensive system designed to resist conventional assault. The final phase did not introduce new conditions. It confirmed the outcome of those that had been present from the beginning.